Hello everyone, Drew Kreisman here from DC Productions and Final Fantasy Weekly, and I wanted to record my early thoughts, I suppose, for a game like Baldur's Gate 3 on, you guessed it, Baldur's Gate 3. I've been tweeting out a little bit about my experiences so far from the Final Fantasy Weekly account, and it's generated enough conversation that I figure why not record some of my thoughts at this point and maybe throughout as I go through the adventure and have some various feelings on it, because I have a lot of feelings about this game. Some very positive, some very frustrating and exhausting. So I did want to begin by saying that it's tough not to frame this too much in what has been an ongoing battle and an ongoing conversation for me and my gaming experiences for years, going at least back to when I was in high school. And this conversation, of course, particularly when it comes to Final Fantasy and linearity and focused storytelling driven video games and things much more like this that are focused on extreme exploration and freedom. Not that there isn't story here, and we'll get to that, but I have long felt, and this is only ramped up in the way Final Fantasy 16 and 7 Remake were discussed, that the games that I tend to enjoy quite a bit more, and yes, 20 hours in, I have enjoyed Final Fantasy 16 more than I have the first 20 hours of Baldur's Gate 3, but that they're often criticized basically for not being this, for not giving you more freedom, for not being more open world, for not having deeper, quote, RPG elements and mechanics. And I wanted to go through and talk about why some of those things are really working for me in Baldur's Gate 3 and why some of them aren't, and why I think we really shouldn't paint with such a broad brush and kind of demand that everything try to be this, because there are pros and cons to all different kinds of gameplay, design, philosophies and styles, and I want to explain a little bit why I connect more at times with things like Final Fantasy 16, but I'm not going to do that too much. I do want this to be largely about my thoughts on Baldur's Gate 3. A couple of important notes before we dive into the game itself. I should note that I have played Dungeons & Dragons before, but it has been quite a while. I played with my brother and some of his friends who still play to this day, so I'm familiar with the world. I'm familiar with some of the terminology. I have vague recollections of building a character and going on adventures and how a lot of it works. Of course, I had to be refreshed and reminded through playing some of this how things like armor class and saving throws and all of that sort of coming back to me, but it's not second nature to me by any means. But even as somebody who had some of that, I felt quite a bit overwhelmed by the beginning of this game and its lack of direction. I'm about 20 hours in. For those wondering, I'm playing as a Gith Bard, and I'm really enjoying my time with it so far. Like I said, I've poured these 20 hours in pretty quick order here, but let's get to some of the things about this whole lack of direction and focus and or freedom and exploration thing that I really want to talk about. Before I do, really quickly, if this is your first time listening, welcome in and thanks for hanging out. Future episodes will be behind a $1 paywall. I really, really appreciate your support for Final Fantasy stuff. It's also going to be on the DC production, so if you're not into Final Fantasy, go over there for like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and all that kind of nerdy stuff. If you are into Final Fantasy, do the $1 on that side, but I'll continue the Baldur's Gate conversation on both Patreon pages, so you only have to pay the $1 if you want to keep up with that. So, I want to begin by talking about where I currently am, and don't worry, this is going to be a totally spoiler-free conversation. I'll give hints to anyone who's played the game before what I'm talking about, but basically, I just went through something in my most recent play session where after feeling like I was really getting the hang of some of the elements of the game I just wasn't familiar with, because again, there's very little and there's really nothing in the way of tutorials. And I know Final Fantasy games can be notorious for being tutorial heavy at the beginning, but I must say I prefer that to this, which was just, I really didn't know what I could or couldn't do, where I was supposed to go, and I understand that you're not really supposed to go anywhere in these games, and I want to get back to that in just a second. But Anyway, I felt like I was really getting the hang of it, right? And then I just came upon this battle that, because of the decisions I had made up to that point, I really couldn't undo without going back and like having a bunch of save files or completely redoing my playthrough, right? I was more or less happy with the decisions that I had made, but now I was stuck in this battle that I couldn't win, and I was trying all kinds of things, ways to get out of it, different strategies to win it, and after a while I was getting very frustrated. For those of you that know me, I don't enjoy FromSoft games for a similar reason. Like, I don't like doing the same battle over and over and over again. Something I'm going to return to at the end here, but it's like, if I play an hour or 2 or 5 of a video game, I like to feel like I've progressed an hour or 2 or 5, and not I've played for 5 hours and I progressed, one boss battle. For me, I know for a lot of people it's very, very satisfying to finally get that win in the end. To me, it's just very, very frustrating. So when I find myself having to redo a battle over and over again, now, people out there are probably saying, well, try something different. And they're right. That is a big thing that makes this game, at least it alleviates a lot of that pain, right? Is that at least every time I went in to redo the battle, I felt like I was trying different things. That said, it just kind of added to the frustration that I was really getting wiped out each time. And I was trying all kinds of different stuff. Ultimately, what I did was I turned my difficulty down to the lowest level, which I was really trying to avoid doing because I feel like, again, people often say that one of the appeals to these games is that they can be a bit difficult, but that if you use, all of the different mechanics and all of the things available to you, you can figure a way out, right? But again, sometimes you do just come into these moments where you were stuck, and so some people suggested maybe I turn down the difficulty, and I did that. And then somebody else suggested to me that they thought they knew where I was, and they were right, and that they ran into a similar problem thinking that they had played the early part a bit too linearly, gone straight to the main plot, and that they were a bit underleveled. And I suspect that's precisely what happened to me. But I also think that means that, doesn't that suggest the game is saying I was supposed to have wandered around more? So that's where we kind of come back to that word, right? Where I feel like some people will say, well, in a linear game, you're supposed to go to the next spot. This is where you're supposed to go that. But in this game, you can do whatever you want. But if what I want to do is go straight to the thing that this person just told me was really important, and that's just how my brain works, right? As much as it's, I'm more used to linear games, part of it was they said, hey, this thing is really important. It is happening right now. You need to go to that place and you need to take care of the problem. And yes, there was a lot of stuff in between, but I didn't really wander around and do a bunch of side quests on my way. I went where I was told to go and ended up getting in, some far more difficult challenges than I was ready for, which suggests to me that there is a way that you're supposed to play this game. And it's not necessarily one that I always find the most entertaining. I don't always like wandering around. One of the main reasons being I feel like it can be a bit much to keep it all in my head, right? That by the time I get to the quest I was given at the beginning that's very important, I've done 20 or 30 side things. I don't even remember, who told me to go where and do what. It's difficult for me to keep all of that in my head, especially when you don't have... Now, this game does have a journal system, which is nice and very helpful and something that I've used, but for me, it can just all be a bit daunting. It can all be a little bit exhausting, right? So I turned down the difficulty, like I said, and then I kind of breezed through that battle, which was interesting to me. I was like, wow, that was really a pretty steep drop-off. And I will say, since turning down the difficulty, I've been enjoying the game quite a bit more because I'm not getting stuck in those battles where I'm having to do them over and over again, and I can just kind of win and continue going to the plot and getting to the parts of the game that I really love, which I'm promising I'm going to talk about here in just a minute. But a few more points on this. I was kind of getting this, but I didn't want to say the larger plot still feels very, very distant. I will say at around the 17 to 20 hour mark, there are a few things that happened that made me feel much more connected to the larger world. They keep talking about these far off places, and there is one sort of central goal, but again, that goal feels so distant, so separate from what we're doing, the tasks that we're regularly doing, that it's very, very difficult for me to feel connected to it. I do feel connected to this little village that we're in, the place that we're in, some of the people that we've met. I'm going to talk about the people here in just a minute. But that, I think, is something that's very, very difficult, and something I'm going to talk about again when I mention, what I want to finish on, which is this idea of 20 hours worth of stuff happening in two different kinds of gameplay design elements, right? So two things that I just wanted to mention as far as flip sides to the freedom and, the you can do anything type of gameplay design. One is that there are certain dialogue moments that feel really out of sync and out of tone when this happens. There are several times now, where I have triggered a dialogue moment from a person that's connected to something that we talked about, a while ago, that I didn't realize was still on the table, right in the middle of us doing something else that's really important. And so we might be like in the middle of running for our lives, and then, I'm trying to open some treasure chest up, and instead I accidentally talk to my teammates, and they want to talk about something that we said in camp a while ago, or something like that. And there have been a few times where this has happened. I will say it doesn't ruin the immersion to me. It's just something I take note of, because I think immersion and a sense of sort of hyper-realism is one of the main draws of this kind of gameplay design. And so for me, when those things don't work, when they don't line up, and you can't control all of that type of thing. I think by its nature, maybe one day somebody will create the absolute perfect open world D&D style experience, and I think it's going to take quite a bit of technology to make that happen. But I think when you've kind of set the stage for you can do anything, it feels more limiting when there's something that you can't do, for me anyway, than oftentimes a world that is, by its design and by its nature, understood to be more limited. When a world tells me right up front, here are the rules, here's where you can go, here's where you can't go, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do, for me, that actually feels in a lot of ways less limiting, because I understand the toolbox or the toy box or whatever, the sandbox that I'm playing in, right? Where here, for example, I was in a dungeon recently and I couldn't figure out how to get from where I was to where I needed to go. But then I saw a piece of rope that I could go and pick up. And I thought, okay, here, we're in the do anything world. If I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with my brother and his friends, what I would say is, all right, can I use that rope and throw it down there and get there? And the DM would say, well, you can sure try. Let's do a roll based on X, Y, and Z. And we'll see if you can, rope your way on down there. But in the video game, you don't know which mechanics are there and which aren't. So I walked to the ledge thinking, okay, use the rope. And I tried it a bunch of different spots, or to see if there was somewhere I was supposed to hook it. Is there a mechanic I'm not understanding? Is this a thing that the game can or cannot do? And I concluded that it was just a thing that the game couldn't do. I thought I had solved the problem. I was like, oh, okay, rope. It happened to be there. My old RPG brain thinking, well, they stuck a rope there, so that was be one of the options you could get down there. And I ended up being able to figure out something else. So it wasn't like it was a game-breaking experience or something that had me throwing my control in frustration. It's just something that, again, I feel like I note when the answer to so many of my issues oftentimes seems to be, we'll experiment and try to do things differently. And the beauty of this game is the freedom of it, right? I think there are those moments when I feel like I have actually cleverly solved the problem, or I feel like I've got a spell that should interact with the environment in one way or another, or do something, and that it doesn't. I feel, again, like that's almost more limiting, because there was no way for me to know that I couldn't do that. Where in other games, I feel like, yeah, you can't do that, but it's understood up front that you can't do that. So I'm not, weirded out or frustrated by it. But I do think, all of that said, on the flip side, and here's where I'm going to get into a lot of the positives. I do have a few more, quibbles, more comparisons at the end, but most of the time, that freedom, I do feel like, is paying off, even for somebody who that isn't, always my go-to gameplay experience, there have been a lot of times where I've felt very satisfied by being able to talk my way out of an issue rather than getting into a fight or sneak around and do something a little bit more stealthily or, approach. I mentioned earlier that I was dying several times in battle. Other than this one time where I got stuck and had to turn on the difficulty, I did find that there were a lot of times where approaching the situation would just change differently, would just change everything that would happen. And so sometimes I wouldn't even end up getting in the fight in the first place, right? And so stuff like that I think is really fun and cool and is at its absolute best when it comes to the characters and their interactions and building the characters from your own and the character creation and all of the awesome stuff that's always come with D&D, choosing your class and growing it and trying to become a perfectionist in what you do. All of the characters that I've met so far that have joined the party are absolutely fascinating, fun, interesting characters that I want to know more about. I really do think that that's what's kept me coming back to playing the game as much as I have. Basically, moments in camp and sitting around and talking are my favorite parts so far. And anytime you get to roll the dice and try to do something that feels very D&D, I think it's great that they kept that mechanic in, and I think it adds a lot to the experience. For me, that's been the best thing. But getting to know the characters and their backstories and their motivations, everybody is voiced so wonderfully. I do miss some of the presentation there. Again, that's something that I think when you do have these bigger, more open worlds and everything is trying to be more immersive and keeping you in a certain kind of perspective and not having, quote, cutscenes. And this is another thing where I think it's just a complete inverse perspective. For some people, cutscenes break immersion, right? For me, it makes it far more immersive because I can get into the world when I'm getting different camera angles and sweeping scenes and a little bit more character movement as opposed to these static screens, something I criticized, by the way, Horizon for, and I love the Horizon games. I think Forbidden West did a much better job of this, right? Is having the characters move around the screen in a much more natural way while they're having conversations. I imagine just due to the size of Baldur's Gate 3, like they had to have a lot of these, the static one person stands in one place. There's a whole bunch of dialogue issues. They move a little bit, but they're just standing there. There's 2 camera angle shots, right? And there are cutscenes. I'm not saying that there aren't any, but again, something that other games are often criticized is for having too many of those. For me, that really does help to break it up and not have everything feel quite so samey. That said, it's not stopping me from falling in love with these characters. And now that I've gotten more and more into the characters through them, I'm much more curious about the rest of the world. But I haven't been able to travel very far. And I haven't really been able to, like I said, do much in terms of the wider story. So it really has just been about, and I will say now that I've sort of completed the first arc in the first little area that you are, I very much enjoyed it. And I do think that if I ever go back and do a replay of this, or I feel like starting over, I would wander around quite a bit more and I would drink in that first little bit. It's clear that it's meant to be experienced that way, but that sort of goes back to my point of like, if what I'm meant to do is wander around and do everything before moving on, then in a way, it's still a linear experience. It's just a longer, windier line. So it's not a line, it's a winding experience. But you know what I mean? Like there's still a way, it's not that free if I'm supposed to play the game that way. There are a handful of things I'm sure you can skip and things, turn out differently. But I just think, again, there are pros and cons to doing it that way. I will say a lot of this is probably on, I've realized, me and the way I happen to play games. I'm getting older. I'm 37, but whatever, but I mostly play games at nighttime after my wife has gone to bed, and typically when I'm fairly tired. And so I think that's another thing where, like, the cutscenes, I've heard people say, criticizing that I just put down my controller for 10 minutes and watch a cutscene. I'm like, yeah, I love doing that. I'm a little bit tired. I need to recharge my batteries and get, refreshed for the next fight or whatever. I'm just going to put it down and watch them talk, maybe get involved when I need to make a decision here or there, right? But I think there is some of that where it's like, for example, managing all the gear and stuff. This is one of those things where I can absolutely see the pros and cons to both sides. On this Baldur's Gate side, you've got an authentic D&D experience where you can really micromanage the hell out of your gear and equipment, and every single thing in the world is something that you can pick up and interact with and do something with, or take it and sell it at market, and there's just everything is there, right? And it's massively daunting and exhausting if you're somebody who is more used to or tends to prefer, or I should say it can be daunting and exhausting, these more streamlined video game RPG experiences, which tend to automatically take care of some of that, optimize equipment, make it a bit clearer what the pluses and minuses are. I've had a lot of people hit me back on Twitter and say they really don't like the UI, the interface of Baldur's Gate, and I don't know that I hate it. I see the advantages to it, and again, it feels very authentic to the D&D experience, though I do feel like a lot of those types of things work and feel better on paper than they do in a video game. I think there's a reason why over the years a lot of video game RPGs have streamlined particularly this stuff, like the equipment and character growth, things like that. You can spend quite a bit of time reading through what all of the spells do, and and that can even be a certain kind of fun in its own way. Like I said, I think there are pros and cons to both. If you want to be hyper meticulous and a micromanager, and you want all of that freedom to do whatever you want with each character, you can do that in D&D, and it's really, really cool. But if you'd rather not spend that much time in the menus and you really rather just get back to playing the game and advancing the story and all of that, you're probably going to prefer a more streamlined system like a traditional Final Fantasy, right? So on that point, let me finish on this. I kept talking about it because this is something that a few people have asked me about on Twitter. I said, I feel like after playing 20 hours of Final Fantasy 16, that 20 hours worth of stuff had happened. Right, I had experienced quite a bit of story, right? Even just the first 2 hours of it felt like an entire, episode of stuff happening, so much stuff happening, and characters being established that I cared deeply about, plots being unveiled, the stage being set, me understanding quite a bit about this world, but also understanding there's a lot more to uncover just in the first couple of hours. And then by hour 20, we've gone through, quite a bit of time. We've had multiple boss battles. We've visited several different areas of the map. We've gone through quite a bit of character development for particularly our main character, but we've been introduced to a lot of new characters. That is one thing that's the same in Baldur's Gate. But again, I feel like 20 hours worth of stuff has happened. And not only that, but every 2 or 3 hours, more big events are happening that are pushing things forward and that are keeping me intrigued about what's going to happen next, right? And I understand that is a fundamentally different experience. And ultimately, my point here should be, and really is, that these things should get to coexist as masteries of two different ways of thinking about how to make a game. Because I don't want to say that in the first 20 hours I don't feel like anything has happened in Baldur's Gate. If I felt like nothing had happened, I wouldn't be playing it, right? I'm like, this is boring. If I thought it was boring, I wouldn't have poured 20 hours into the game in a week. But I couldn't, tell you, even if I wanted to go all spoilery, here's what's going on. Right? I could tell you the premise, the start, but since then, it's been like, well, I've met this character and I've talked to them more about their life and they worship this god and they're from this place and I kind of like the way that they talk about certain things, and then I met this other character and here's their deal, that. And again, I do think that's been the strength of the game so far, and there are maybe worse ways to set up a larger story than getting me invested in a bunch of different characters from kind of all over the world, right? That's one thing that is, like I said, sort of connecting me to it. But I don't feel like anything has really progressed. And I feel like I've had a lot of people hit me up on Twitter and say, I had this similar experience, or the game gets really good around, level 5, which I'm not quite to yet, or maybe around hour 30 or 40. People say, once you hit hour 100, then it really started. And I'm like, that's a lot of time to put into something that, but again, it's a good thing that my overall experience with it has been very positive. So it's not like I'm totally negative on it. It can just be a little bit daunting and a little bit exhausting. I do find myself at times wanting to put it down in favor of, playing a little bit more of 16. I'm trying to platinum that a little bit, or, a couple of rounds of Civilization or something like that just makes a bit more sense to me, because I feel like in this game, semi-regularly, I get stuck because I'm not quite sure where. It's not even that I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go. It's that I'm not sure where I can go. And that can be, I guess I keep coming back to that word, a little bit exhausting. It's not that I hate it, it's just that I find that sometimes I'll wander around, or I'll play the game for several hours, and other than a couple of interactions in camp, I haven't been able to really figure anything out, and I've just died in a couple of different battles, and I've had to redo a couple of conversations, and that part of it can be frustrating. That said, I do think after lowering the difficulty and getting the hang of the game a little bit more, and focusing more in, and realizing the pace, the incredibly slow pace this game wants me to play at, and just kind of succumbing to that, as it were, I'm going to try to play it the way I believe it is intended to be played. That is something that I just sort of want to put out there and say that should be sort of the across-the-board thing, right? That's how I finished the Final Fantasy 16 video, is that at some point you've got to recognize this for what it's actually trying to do and for what it is, and not just try to play it your own way and get mad at it that you can't play it that way. I do think there's a little bit of difficulty when one of the main draws of the game is you can play it however you want, and there are some ways where you can't. But when I realized that there is a way in which the game is played best, maybe that's the best way to put it, that where you can maximize your own enjoyment of it, I stand by my feeling that it'd be made much better if there were some tutorials at the beginning of the game. I really, really believe that it could have stood from just explaining some of the basics about how combat works and how you can interact with the world, and even saying explicitly to you in the game things that people have been saying to me on Twitter, like, try things, take your time, stuff like that. I think if that just would have been explicitly in the game, I've had several people suggest, outside sources that I should check out, YouTube videos and some Wikipedia articles that'll really help me understand how to play the game better. And I really appreciate that stuff, and I might check it out. But again, I would argue that stuff should be in the game. For all of the criticisms that were levied at Final Fantasy XVI's gameplay system, I never once felt confused about what I could or couldn't do, how the game was, quote, supposed to be played. And I enjoyed its mechanics from the moment I started battle to the very end. I enjoyed playing that game, where with Baldur's Gate, sometimes in battle I'm like, that was cool, that was awesome, I'm really getting the hang of this, is fantastic, this is great. And other times I'm just feel like, okay, there's nothing I can do, just 40 dudes are going to show up and throw me off this cliff and I'm dead. So it's just like, I don't know, pros and cons. There is no one right way to make an RPG. This is a good lesson to learn. Game of the year, highly recommended by literally everybody that I know, and I'm enjoying the hell out of it. But I don't still believe that this is the one correct way to make an RPG, or that this is inherently a better way to make an RPG that comes with, I feel like a lot of people sold this as sort of something that if not perfect, was close to. right? Or that we oftentimes don't talk about the downsides of some of this hyper freedom exploration style game. And I'm feeling them right now, despite my overall massive enjoyment with this. So I'll keep you updated. Hopefully I won't talk that long every time, but we'll see. Obviously, I've got a lot of thoughts on this, and I'll continue to have a lot of thoughts as I progress and as I try to institute some of the advice that I've gotten from people on Twitter. So thanks for listening in. I hope you will consider subscribing to the Patreon page for just $1. Again, either one, DC Productions or FF Weekly, will get you access to these Baldur's Gate conversations, though you'll get access to other different things depending on each one there. So thanks for listening in. Thanks for being absolutely awesome out there. I'll keep being absolutely Drew Creasman in here. And until next time, I will see you out there in the world.